So Israel lived his final 17 years in peace and safety, protected by the Son of Promise, the Saviour of the world, governing over all. Just as Israel will dwell safely in the millennial kingdom after Daniel's final 7 terrible years in the land of promise, under the authority and protection of the mighty Son of Promise and the mighty Saviour of the world, Yeshua, Jesus. We also shouldn't overlook the full life cycle this 17 years demonstrates. Joseph lived under the care and protection of his father during his first 17 years. This care and protection was lovingly reciprocated by Joseph to Jacob in his final 17 years. Genesis 47 verse 1. Then Joseph went and told Pharaoh and said, "My father and my brothers, their flocks and their herds, and all that they possess, have come from the land of Canaan, and indeed they are in the land of Goshen." And he took 5 men from among his brothers and presented them to Pharaoh. Once again, this number 5 comes up. 5 years of drought remaining. Benjamin received 5-fold of food and 5 new garments. And now 5 of the 11 brothers presented to Pharaoh. I've heard many preachers say 5 is the biblical number of grace. I've read many of their arguments, which seem more like bubble and squeak rather than systematic Bible analysis. But maybe they're right, as Joseph does show incredible grace towards his brothers, and 5 of them get the honour of meeting Pharaoh. It seems very likely Joseph withholds his brother's betrayal of him from Pharaoh. I can't imagine Pharaoh reacting kindly if he heard they'd sold Joseph into slavery. What happens next is fascinating. Verse 3. Then Pharaoh said to his brothers, "What is your occupation?" Most teachers say Joseph in chapter 46 told his brothers to be an open book with Pharaoh when asked about your occupation. But I don't fully agree with this consensus analysis. Joseph told his brothers specifically, "Tell Pharaoh your occupation has been with livestock." This was true, but it was a more palatable answer in Egypt. They were experts in all type of livestock. Remember, the Egyptians had a strong repulsion for sheep herders, for shepherds in particular. But animal traders, no stigma was associated with that in Egypt. So I believe Joseph was looking to conceal, not in a completely dishonest way, but in a politically smart way. Maybe his family could get out of this meeting without totally embarrassing Joseph. I previously speculated that this Pharaoh was not Egyptian, but an outsider, likely a Semite. So reading closely Joseph's instructions to his brothers in the last chapter, Joseph would privately tell Pharaoh they were shepherds, which, if he was a Semite, wouldn't have offended him. But the brothers were to publicly state they were animal traders, respectable to the ears of the wider Egyptian court officials. And they said to Pharaoh, "Your servants are shepherds, both we and also our fathers." And they said to Pharaoh, "We have come to dwell in the land because your servants have no pasture for their flocks, for the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. Now therefore, please let your servants dwell in the land of Goshen." So if I'm right, his brothers totally disregard Joseph's carefully prepared plans and declare before all the high officials of Egypt they're an abhorrency, a defiled people, an abomination in Egypt. Maybe they decided they've learned their lesson. Lies and half-truths only brought them trouble and tribulation. Perhaps they decided to turn over a new leaf. From now on, they'd be total open books. Well, in this instance, their instinct for truth works well for them. And given they were openly a family of shepherds, they would live in Egypt, but separated from the Egyptians. God had to get them out of Canaan, as if they stayed there, the Canaanite population would have absorbed them. But in Egypt, they could grow separated, distinct from the Egyptians, relatively uncorrupted by the Egyptian polytheism. They live in Goshen, which means to draw together or drawing near. Verse 5, Then Pharaoh spoke to Joseph, saying, Your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is before you. Have your father and brothers dwell in the best of the land. Let them dwell in the land of Goshen. And if you know any competent men among them, then make them chief herdsmen over my livestock. Pharaoh feels no repulsion towards these Hebrew shepherds. In fact, quite the opposite. He ratifies Joseph's plan to give them the very best of the land of Egypt, the floodplains of Goshen. He wants the most talented of the Semite brothers to look after his livestock. He knew the Semites were famed for their animal husbandry. You see, Egyptians were world leaders in crop farming. Egypt grew rich and powerful off the back of crop farming, along the rich, fertile soils of the floodplains of the Nile. The Nile River would seasonally and predictably burst its banks, spreading rich alluvial soil across the extensive floodplains, and Egypt became the breadbasket of the known world for centuries. They knew crop farming, but livestock farming they weren't as renowned. So Pharaoh is happy to bring in some Hebrew expertise, adding a little more evidence that perhaps this Pharaoh was himself a Semite outsider. Verse 7, Then Joseph brought in his father Jacob and set him before Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh. So Jacob, this ancient prophet of God, is presented by his loving son Joseph to Pharaoh. From the previous chapter, it seems Joseph was nervous how his father would interact with Egyptian royalty. Jacob isn't concerned with the traditions and protocols, the pomp and ceremony of the house of Pharaoh. He immediately pronounces a blessing upon Pharaoh, almost certainly pronounced with the authority of the name of his God. And Pharaoh accepts this blessing without objection or hesitation. Pharaoh seems instantly impressed by Jacob. Verse 8, Pharaoh said to Jacob, How old are you? And Jacob said to Pharaoh, The days of the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life, and they have not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers, in the days of their pilgrimage. So Jacob blessed Pharaoh, and went out from before Pharaoh. Jacob, the heel grabber, the usurper, is no longer the brash, headstrong, manipulating, self-centered man. Jacob has learned humility. He doesn't recount how he bested his brothers, or saw a ladder to heaven, or how he got rich in Syria, nor does he boast of his 4 wives, 12 sons, and many grandsons, or how he wrestled with God, or saw 2 companies of angels, or how he was God's chosen man of promise. He tells Pharaoh he's lived 130 tough years, far fewer than his father and grandfather. He's no one special, of no particular note. Then proceeds to bless Pharaoh a second time, then left for his new home in Goshen. Verse 11, And Joseph situated his father and his brothers and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramesses, as Pharaoh had commanded. Then Joseph provided his father, his brothers, and all his father's household with bread, according to the number in their families. Joseph looks after his extended family, giving each of the family units an allotment of land for their flocks. This is the 4th time from my count it's stated the best of the land of Egypt is given to the family of Israel. Joseph, the prophet of God, understands this is to be a long stay for Israel in the land of Egypt. Almost certainly Joseph knew of the prophecy given to Abraham about 400 years mistreated in a foreign land. That 400 years didn't commence whilst the present Pharaoh ruled and whilst Joseph was governor of Egypt. The first 30 years of Israel's 430 years sojourn in Egypt were as privileged guests. The first 5 years in particular, they received near royal privilege, bread supplied free, it seems, from Joseph's great wealth. The mention of the land of Ramesses has caused some understandable misdirection. In all likelihood, it wasn't known as the land of Ramesses in the days when they first arrived. This is the name given to the region over 4 centuries later when Moses wrote Genesis. For the record, I don't go on Pharaoh hunts, guessing which Pharaoh was this one and the Moses pharaohs. Egyptian history is too much of a moving target. Verse 13. Now there was no bread in all the land, for the famine was very severe, so that the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished because of the famine. And Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, for the grain which they bought. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. So when the money failed in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, Give us bread, for why should we die in your presence? For the money has failed. Due to the foresight of Joseph, not only was he able to save the people of Egypt, but also all the surrounding nations. In the process of saving the world, Joseph made Egypt greatly wealthy. Egypt was already the superpower of the age before Joseph came to Egypt. But God blessed the empire of Egypt abundantly under Joseph's governorship. Egypt vacuumed up all the silver and gold of the region. But the famine still continued, and the people had no money left to buy more grain. So Joseph will come up with a new solution to feeding the population. Joseph shows himself to be a man of incredible enterprise. On a side note, in verse 14 in the New King James, it says, For the grain which they bought. In the much outdated King James, it says, And the corn which they bought. This just happens to be the 7th time the word corn is used in this Joseph narrative. Corn simply did not exist in the 1920s BC in Egypt. Corn came to Europe and became very popular about 100 years before the 1611 King James Bible was written. I've heard attempts to explain away this error. In Old English, corn meant any type of grain. Corn, a word taken from Old Norse. But we never today use corn in that way, and we don't speak Old English or Old Norse. Using corn in this context in the 21st century is simply a bad interpretation. This is just one amongst hundreds of examples demonstrating to an objective listener how out of date the King James truly is. I myself have a strong preference for the New King James Version of the Bible. Verse 16, Then Joseph said, Give your livestock, and I will give you bread for your livestock if the money is gone. So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them bread in exchange for the horses, the flocks, the cattle of the herds, and for the donkeys. Thus he fed them with bread in exchange for all their livestock that year. When that year had ended, they came to him the next year and said to him, We will not hide from my lord that our money is gone. My lord also has our herds of flock. There is nothing left in the sight of my lord but our bodies and our lands. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for bread, and we and our land will be servants of Pharaoh. Give us seed that we may live and not die, that the land may not be desolate. So Joseph systematically vacuums up all the entire wealth of Egypt and the surrounding regions. The money first, then the livestock, then finally the land and the people's lives offered as servants to Pharaoh. And at this point in time, we can begin to imagine the centralization of power in the world. Power and authority held by Pharaoh, with benevolent Joseph, the right arm, governing and overseeing this power. Whilst Joseph remained in charge, we'll see the even-handedness of his wielding of this authority. But once Joseph was no longer the governor, this power quickly metastasized into something evil. Verse 20. Then Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for every man of the Egyptians sold his field, because the famine was severe upon them. So the land became Pharaoh's. And as for the people, he moved them into the cities, from one end of the borders of Egypt to the other end. Only the land of the priests he did not buy, for the priests had rations allotted to them by Pharaoh, and they ate their rations, which Pharaoh gave them. Therefore they did not sell their lands. Joseph wisely at this point urbanizes the entire population. Until the 7 years were at an end, what was the point of anyone living in distant farmlands? Plus, it stopped the optimistic farmers wasting grain in a vain attempt to harvest a small crop. All the country folk moved to the city until the 7 bad years were complete, where they could put their labour to more profitable or worthwhile means. Only the priests held onto their land, as they received special privilege direct from Pharaoh. Verse 23. Then Joseph said to the people, Indeed, I have bought you and your land this day for Pharaoh. Look, here is the seed for you, and you shall sow the land. And it shall come to pass in the harvest that you shall give 1/5 to Pharaoh. 4/5 shall be your own, as seed for the field, and for your food, for those of your households, and as food for your little ones. So they said, You have saved our lives. Let us find favour in the sight of my Lord, and we will be Pharaoh's servants. And Joseph made it a law over the land of Egypt to this day that Pharaoh should have 1/5, except for the land of the priests only, which did not become Pharaoh's. One of the tough realities of farming. You don't know what will happen with the weather in the future. At some point, the rains will come and the droughts will end. But if you sow your seed too early, those crops will wither and die, and you'll have wasted what precious little grain you had left. But Joseph knows, as the 7 years draws to an end, it's time for the farmers to get back to work. Prepare the fields, get ready to plant the seed. Good times are coming again. With Pharaoh owning the livestock, the land and the people, Joseph could have easily overburdened the people. But instead, Joseph imposes an across-the-board 20% rate of taxation on the harvest, leaving 80% for the people. This probably meant roughly 40% for next season's sowing and 40% for personal consumption and trade. Something everyone agreed was a more than fair arrangement. And I agree. A flat 20% rate of taxation is something I think would be reasonable even in our modern 21st century world. Verse 27. So Israel dwelt in the land of Egypt, in the country of Goshen, and they had possession there and grew and multiplied exceedingly. The people of Israel grew exceedingly in Goshen. They stayed close together in this northern Nile Delta region. They married their sisters and cousins and second cousins, etc. Whereas W.A. Criswell put it, in a fiery furnace the nation was built, and its sinews of steel and devotion were welded together. The Egyptians considered these sheep herders an abomination. Isn't it interesting, amazing, how God used this quirky Egyptian cultural sentiment, a strange reviling of sheep herders, to keep this Hebrew family separated whilst they matured in Egypt, an idiom for the world, reminding us that whilst we dwell in the world, we are not of this world. We're merely sojourners, maturing in our faith, awaiting for God's timing of our future home in glory. Israel ultimately dwelt in Egypt for 430 years, but they were not Egyptians. This was not their permanent home, but merely their dwelling place, till God's appointed time for them to move to the land of promise. A home in a distant place, a hope for tomorrow, of a safe dwelling place of their own, a place of peace. Verse 28, and Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. So the length of Jacob's life was 147 years. When the time drew near that Israel must die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, "Now, if I have found favour in your sight, please put your hand under my thigh, and deal kindly and truly with me. Please do not bury me in Egypt, but let me lie with my fathers. You shall carry me out of Egypt, and bury me in the burial place." And he said, "I will do as you have said." Then he said, "Swear to me." And he swore to him. So Israel bowed himself on the head of the bed. It's difficult to know for sure what Jacob at this time knew about the future hope of the resurrection. As a prophet of God, perhaps God had given him special and direct revelation about the future. He definitely shows a faith and a strong belief in the resurrection. He wants to rise in the land of promise alongside his wife, his father and grandfather. Why else would he insist on his Machpelah burial? He had an expectation of an earthly resurrection and an eternal dwelling place on earth. Jacob had a different hope to us. The Old Testament saints all had an earthly hope based on the earthly promises God made to them. We, the church era saints, have an expectation of a resurrection also, but our hope is of a heavenly place of eternal dwelling. Some Christians vainly attempt to spiritualize the Old Testament promises of an earthly hope, seeking to misappropriate the promises made to the Old Testament saints for themselves. But if you diligently and faithfully search the Scriptures, you'll identify there are at least two different sets of promises God made to at least two different sets of saints. In this closing account, Jacob's absolutely adamant that he has to be buried in the land of promise. Joseph is the most trustworthy of his sons, and the one with the authority of Pharaoh to carry out Jacob's wishes. So Jacob has Joseph engage in what appears to us a very strange oath-making process. We saw it back in Genesis 24, when Eliezer swore to Abraham to find a wife for Isaac. So Israel lived his final 17 years in peace and safety, protected by the Son of Promise, the Saviour of the world, governing over all. Just as Israel will dwell safely in the millennial kingdom after Daniel's final 7 terrible years in the land of promise, under the authority and protection of the mighty Son of Promise and the mighty Saviour of the world, Yeshua, Jesus. We also shouldn't overlook the full life cycle this 17 years demonstrates. Joseph lived under the care and protection of his father during his first 17 years. This care and protection was lovingly reciprocated by Joseph to Jacob in his final 17 years. After the death of Jacob, his sons would live another 13 years as guests in Egypt, but then, for 400 long years, they'd be oppressed and afflicted in this foreign land, exactly as God had predicted to Abraham 245 years before this occurred. Until our next study, may God richly bless you all.